Welcome to Open BXRX Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Since the start of the pandemic, many people began taking a closer look at their overall health. Now, the Food and Drug Administration released new SALT guidelines as heart disease continues to be the nation's leading cause of death. We'll now look at a quick video released from the FDA on salt intake.
You may have heard too much sodium leads to high blood pressure, a leading cause of heart disease and stroke. Over 70% of sodium you eat comes from packaged and restaurant foods. Tossing the salt shaker may not help much, but trying new approaches may have a bigger impact. Deli meats, pizza, burritos and tacos, soups, and savory snacks, to name a few. Before you buy, check the labels to compare the sodium content of different brands of the same types of products. You may be surprised that there's a fair amount of variety among similar foods. Aim to stay under the recommended daily value for sodium. As a general guide, 5% dV or less of sodium per serving is considered low, and 20% dV or more of sodium per serving is considered high. Add more flavor to your food. Try no salt seasoning blends and herbs and spices instead of salt. For more information, check out our website.
Joining us for discussion on the guidelines is Dr. Marlene Schwartz, Director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health. Doctor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question, just to start it all off, is can you just explain what sodium is?
What sodium is? Sodium is a mineral, and it is added to foods for a few reasons. One is it helps preserve the food, which helps with food safety, and it also adds flavoring to the food.
Okay, so the FDA issued guidelines for reducing sodium in commercially processed, packaged, and prepared food over the next 2.5 years. The FDA reports that Americans consume on average 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day, nearly 50% more than the recommended limit. Can you explain why this is a problem in regards to health?
Sure. So one of the major concerns about excess sodium intake is that it increases hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which in turn increases your risk of stroke and heart disease. And those are two of the major killers in the United States. So clearly, if we want to try to decrease those health problems, we need to take a step back and decrease people's consumption of sodium.
So now I think this may be like a little controversial, but do you think these companies should be held accountable for the amount of salt, sugar in foods, or is it our responsibility as consumers?
So I definitely feel like the companies hold a lot of responsibility. There are a few reasons for this. I think that we as consumers certainly can try to make the best choices we have, but we're limited to what's available in the store. And I also think that among lower income Americans, they often have even fewer choices because they're trying to find the sort of getting the most food for their money, which often means leading to more processed foods. And so it's really up to the companies to make sure that the foods that are available are the healthiest that they can be.
That kind of segues into my next question. I recently learned that majority of sodium consumed comes from processed and packaged food and not from just adding salt to your food. So I know a lot of people who go to the doctor, they may be told like, hey, you need to cut down on the salt. And I wanted to know, how does this affect low income families in particular? Because I know we often hear that families who are low income have a lot more problems when it comes to health, just in general.
Exactly. I think that, depending on where you live, you have a very different food environment. And there has been a lot of research showing that neighborhoods where people live, the types of foods that are available to them can really influence their health. So I think we need to really focus on making sure that the choices that are out there are healthy and that we aren't sort of taking the least healthy choices, the most processed foods, and sort of making those super available, like in every convenience store and gas station, and there's vending machines all over the place. So it's sort of ironic that the most inexpensive, highly palatable, available foods are the very ones that we're trying to encourage people to eat less of. And certainly people who are lower income and have those financial constraints are the ones that are going to have the hardest time, going and has sort of buying the fresher foods if they're not available, number one. And number two, because you want things that are shelf stable if you don't have time to go shopping all the time. So that's another problem that can then factor into this.
And I understand that you actually kind of look at this closely when it comes to food, like school meals and charitable food system. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So we've been doing a lot of research in school food. And, the good news is, certainly since I've been studying this, which really dates back to the 1990s, food in schools has gotten a lot better. And that was really because of federal regulation and really requiring that school meals and the snacks sold in schools meet certain requirements. And sodium was one of the nutrients they really paid attention to. And the reason it worked is because when you have requirements for a setting as big as schools, the food industry that wants to continue selling their food in schools has no choice. They need to reformulate, they need to create healthier snacks, they need to, cut the sodium in some of the other products that they sell to schools. So that's why I really feel like sort of the federal regulation leading the industry to make changes is how ultimately we're going to see really big effects. But one of the challenges is that the regulations changed as a result of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. And I have heard through some of our research that food service directors have a hard time finding a lot of different choices for things, particularly in the grain category, pastas, pizza crusts, things like that, that meet the sodium requirements. So that's why I think it's just really important that we continue to put the pressure on the industry to reformulate. The other setting you asked about was the Charitable Food Network. So that is a national network of food banks, which are sort of like these big warehouses. There's probably about between 200 and 250 of those around the country. And then food pantries, which is often what people think of. Those are the, sort of churches or community organizations that have a place where people can actually come and pick up the food. And one of the things that's been really interesting in studying this network is, of course, having shelf stable food is incredibly important because a lot of those food pantries have limited refrigeration and they're also open limited hours. And so you really need to make sure that you have food available for people when they can come and get it. And the food there is donated. So again, you really are depending on the food industry to have the healthy products in the first place so that people can then donate them to food banks and food pantries, and people who, are having trouble affording enough food are able to go and access those healthier foods.
As we know, the FDA issued the final guidance with voluntary targets for reducing sodium in commercially processed food. Do you think this is a step in the right direction?
Well, it's definitely a step in the right direction. As I mentioned before, I think a lot of the big changes will be seen when there are a little bit stronger regulations where it's not just sort of a voluntary recommendation, but actually a regulation. And this is kind of the way it works. What I've learned sort of from being in this field for a while is oftentimes you start off with something that's voluntary, you start off with a recommendation, and that really gives the food industry time to figure out the best strategy to reformulate to try to meet the recommendations. But eventually, I think it will be important for there to be a little bit of a stronger regulation, particularly as I mentioned, for foods that are like sold in schools or in another setting where you have people that you feel like need particular protection.
I'm so happy you mentioned that because that is a very key word, voluntary. And so that doesn't mean that they have to do it, but it's kind of like encouraged for them to do it. So I'm really happy that you pointed that out. So the FDA hopes to decrease the average sodium intake by about 12%. Do you think that's enough or should it be a little bit more?
So again, it's sort of strategy, right? Like you have your wish list, you have like the amount that it would need to decrease to actually meet the recommendations, which would be more than that. But at the same time, I think when you're trying, especially with behavior change, whether it's behavior change with people or behavior change with companies, it's still behavior change. And a lot of times you're better off starting gradually, starting with something that feels attainable, that feels manageable. And often when it comes to reformulating food, it's a big investment on the part of the food companies to come up with new formulas for their products. And they worry, my impression is from sort of hearing them over the years, is that they worry about it not tasting as good. They worry about their competitors' food still tasting better. So you kind of need to nudge all of them at the same time slowly so that number one, consumers can get used to the changes in the taste, and two, that the competitors are kind of doing the same thing. And so I think it's a good strategy. I think it makes sense to do it this way, but it definitely isn't maybe as dramatic or as strong of a regulation as some sort of health advocates would have wanted.
So, as I mentioned before, it's a little tricky to control considering high sodium intake isn't from just simply adding too much salt to your dish. What's one tip you have for reading nutrition labels? And what should we look for and what should we avoid?
So, I'm so happy that we have nutrition labels and I actually am really pleased with the changes that took place just a couple years ago. They were updated. So now the sort of font is bigger, the calories is a lot bigger. I think that, there's a lot of numbers there and it is hard to keep a lot of numbers in your head. So, you could try to just focus on that DV column, which is the daily value, percent daily value. And so for a lot of the nutrients, it will tell you if it's, a, exactly. So for a lot of them, it'll show what the percent daily value is. And basically, you can look and see if it's a low number for like this product that is on right now is 19% daily value. So that's pretty high. I think you want to go to sort of no more than 5% daily value. And then once it's really getting like up 19, 20%, I think that's a high sodium product. There are labels oftentimes that are regulated by the FDA. So something has to be, I think, below 130 milligrams of sodium to be considered low sodium. And so you can go by that low sodium, but a lot of products, it's just not labeled on the front of the pack. You have to actually look at the back of the pack.
All right, doctor, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Could you just let everybody know where they can keep in contact or stay in touch with your organization?
Oh, sure. So the Yukon Red Center, our website is yukonredcenter.org. We do have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for there. And then we're also on Twitter and in addition on Facebook.
All right, thank you so much. We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.